Hey there, welcome to a discussion of the difference between a synthesizer and a sampler. Now, synths and samplers are two different types of instruments that can create really wonderful sounds for your recordings. But how do you know which is the right one to choose? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about the basic differences between synthesizers and samplers. I'll give you some examples. We'll listen to how they do things differently. And we'll also talk about some of the, variations between a synth and a sampler, because you have some samplers that are really half hybrid synths and samplers. And then we'll also talk about just the unique aspects of a loop player, which is really just a sampler that plays a sample repeatedly. Before we go any farther though, I'm going to take a sip of coffee and I urge you to sit back and relax. Damn good coffee. Okay, so we're going to talk about synths and samplers in this video. Before we go farther though, I do want to invite you to download a free cheat sheet. If you use Reason, this is going to talk you through all the different devices in Reason and make sure that you're choosing the right Reason device every time. Okay, so a synthesizer from a high level really is just a device that generates its own tones and then processes them. As you'll see in the upcoming demo that'll come after this of a synthesizer, basically what it does is it uses what's called an oscillator to create a wave form or any other sound. And from there, it is manipulated through velocity envelopes and filtering and a bunch of other tools and techniques that creates a lively, lovely sound. This is the basics of synthesizers. There are all sorts of other types of synthesizers, but this is the basic synthesizer here. You have one oscillator, maybe two, maybe three, and together you can mix in their waves. You choose their frequency range, what tuning they're in. It goes through some filtering and some processing, and basically you can choose sort of the dynamics of both the filtering and the overall waveform itself. Now, as you'll see in the demo, the simple tone of a mixer of a synthesizer is pretty boring, which is why you have to add these other aspects to it. Now, let's take that and compare it to the difference between a synthesizer and a sampler. A sampler is a very different beast at its heart. What a sampler does is it actually takes just a recording of any real instrument and plays it back. So for example, you could record a real piano, middle C, played lightly, and then drop it into your sampler. And if you wanted to hit middle C played lightly, when you hit the middle C key, that's what'll happen. Now, where samplers get really interesting is when you start taking multiple different samples, right? So in the simplest version, you have middle C played lightly, and when you play D, what the sampler will do is pitch up the D slightly, or if you want to play C an octave up, it's going to pitch it up 12 semitones, and that's going to start to sound really fake. Maybe that's what you're going for, maybe it's not. Similarly, if you play it loud or soft, it's really just going to turn up the volume, but that's not what a real piano does. A real piano sounds different and reacts differently at different velocities. So where sampling gets really interesting is if you were to, for example, take every note on the keyboard on a real piano and record it played soft, medium, and loud, and then maybe you also add in the sound of it being played with the pedal on and the pedal off. You record short notes and long notes and all of that, and you create a scripting engine that accurately chooses which note to play. So there you have it in a nutshell. The basic difference between a synth and a sampler is that the synthesizer generates all of its own tones, where a sampler is based on a real instrument. All right, it's time to actually see some examples of the difference between a synthesizer and a sampler. So on the left, we have Europa, which is a synthesizer. What it does is it takes sound from this oscillator, based on the shape of the oscillator, it can modify that and filter it and apply some effects, and then it goes to the amp envelope. In contrast with the NNXT, you'll put in a sound and then you manipulate its pitch and maybe do some filtering, but it's more or less generating, it's more about manipulating a pre-recorded sound. So let's listen to just the most basic version of the Europa. And let's move that up an octave. And so if I were to change the style of the oscillator, that's where the sound is actually being generated. And the shape of it will affect it a lot. And for example, you can then filter the sound so that certain parts don't fully make it through. So this is cutting off some of the high end. And then you can affect the amplitude of it. So this will make it so that you don't hear the initial sound because the attack is being lengthened, or we could make it extra short by having no decay. And if we take this, that's almost so short you can't hear it. And so these are the basic components of synthesis. It's the oscillator being filtered and then processed. In contrast, let's look at this sampler. Right now, if I hit a button, no sound's going to come up because there's no sample to manipulate. But if we go to, for example, orchestra sounds, which is some of the sounds built into Reason, and we take a harp, and this is just a harp playing C#3. We can drop that into the sample window of NNXT. And now if I play a C3, so what it's doing right there is just manipulating the pitch of it. But if we were to go up another octave, it starts to sound pretty fake. Which is, that there is a high-pitched, that's what it should really sound like at this octave. Instead, what we're hearing is just a pitched up version. So with a sample, what you're really doing is playing back a bunch of little recordings and then manipulating that. So let's go and actually load the harp up. So instead of just doing one sample, let's pull this up. And you'll see the way they've done it is they've actually assigned different recordings to a bunch of different keys so that you get a much more natural sound. You can also apply a filter to it if you want. And you could alter the attack or the decay. So short you can't even hear it. So there you have it. Really, they are starting from a very different spot and applying very similar processes after that to sculpt your sound. And with samples, you're going to be limited by the quality of your sample library, and they can be, in some cases, very expensive. But with synths, there's a lot of variation to what they can do, and the best ones are going to be able to modulate your sound in really interesting and complex ways. But then again, you can filter a sampler, as we discussed. You can also modify its attack and release characteristics on most samplers. But the real thing that I want to talk about now is how to decide when to use a sampler and when to use a synthesizer. And as a general rule, you're going to want to use a sampler whenever you're trying to replicate a real instrument. And what I mean by a real instrument is, a real piano, a real orchestra, something that you're not trying to make synthetic. Now, Certainly, you could also sample a keyboard or a synthesizer. You could sample, a legendary synthesizer and play it back, and you get some really cool sounds, but maybe you wouldn't get some of the, randomness that a synthesizer brings to things, because there's drift, there's non-linear aspects of actually synthesizing something on the fly. Similarly, though, I think a synthesizer is great for when you're going for more synthetic sounds. Any sort of hip-hop, electronic, EDM, just reach straight for a synthesizer to start with. Also, there are a lot of drum synthesizers out there. The most famous being the 808, which you hear in all the hip-hop tracks, and the 909, which you hear in all the EDM classics. They're synthesizing drum hits. Just like you could also have a sampler that has samples of an 808 and literally plays those back, you could have a synthesizer that emulates the processing of the 808. So when it comes to choosing whether to use a synthesizer or a sampler, I think the choice is really up to you. It's going to be based partially on what you have in your library. If you have a lot of really good samples in your library, then maybe you're more inclined to use a sampler. If you've got a lot of good synthesizers, VSTs or rack extensions, then maybe that's the choice you make. When it comes to choosing the best sampler, I would say that if you're using Reason, NNXT is the place to start. But if you have access to Kontakt, I think that's an even more powerful player. Not necessarily for creating your own samples and instruments, because that gets pretty complicated in Kontakt, but if you can purchase some nice libraries, I think the scripting that is in Kontakt is just a lot more advanced. So you can, it can kind of switch between legato and, staccato really quickly on the fly. It can just do much more intelligent things than the NXT can off the bat. Let's also talk about the unique instance of loops. Loops are basically just a sample that repeats endlessly. Now, Reason it comes with the Rex loop player, which is a great loop player, and using Reason you can convert any wave file into a loop. Now, whether or not it'll loop seamlessly depends on the quality of the loop, but it's really just a sample that's played over and over again. Or, you can just have, instead of using a sample player, you can just trigger the same sample to play repeatedly. You could load up a regular sampler like NNXT or Kontakt, and on every quarter note, the sample just plays again and again and again, or every bar, whatever its length is. Similarly, you have the ability to take a loop and chop it into smaller bits and sample those. And if you want to learn all about sampling and Reason, I've got a whole series of videos on that. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope the videos were helpful in sort of giving you examples of the difference between a sampler and a synthesizer. If you've got any questions, leave them down below. Thanks.